So I want to open with a question. How did you choose your seat for the first time in this room? How did you get here? What or whom did you follow? Did you ask someone the way? Had you consulted signage? Were you coming in alone or with others? What were for you the ethical or political implications of accessing this space? That's a lot of influencing factors for a hopefully fairly straightforward navigation with a large number of variables for each individual. But it makes the point that using guides of one kind or another runs through everything we do, and not only when we're discovering something for the first time, since on subsequent occasions we're guiding ourselves and potentially also others. Late medieval French literature is awash with guidance and guide figures, particularly in its narrative literature, and narrative poetry is what I'm speaking about. Perhaps most famously in personified avatars of Boethius's Lady Philosophy. This prevalence is unsurprising given the dominant didactic mode of late medieval French narratives and the epistemological journeys that they stage, whether pilgrimages towards spiritual salvation or personal peregrinations to self-knowledge or amorous fulfillment. Today, I want to tease out some of the specificities of what constitutes a guide in the genre of the dits, the very baggy label given to lengthy first-person narrative poems of the 14th and 15th centuries that recount a usually masculine narrator's adventures in love and in writing about love. Dits tend to focus as much on the act of telling as on the content of the tale itself. For example, the way these narrative verse texts often include other forms, such as lyric forme fixe or epistolary prose, contributes a strong metatextual dimension. In their manuscript context, they are frequently illustrated, with some programs of miniatures overseen by the poem's author. Text-image relationships thereby bring into play intervisuality alongside intertextuality. The whole production of a dits thus demonstrates richly multifaceted attention to the presentation and framing of experience and knowledge. Accordingly, I hold that a first key aspect of the guidance that they dramatize is the how rather than the what. Guide figures in text and image shape processes of understanding rather than providing a knowledge product. They issue an invitation rather than imposing instruction. Guidance is therefore necessarily imperfect. The first-person protagonists seeking guidance in Dits by Guillaume de Machaut, Jean Froissart, Christine Pizan, or Alain Chartier are frequently subject to irony, often comically so. The extra-textual audience learns from these personae as refractions, not reflections, of their author, who in turn offers their personas mistakes and questionable perceptions for critical scrutiny. As audience, we're therefore apt to want to distance ourselves from the protagonist's misprisions to enjoy the privilege of appreciating dramatic irony. However, I want precisely to suggest our alignment with these personae as a 21st century academic audience, reflecting today on our own inevitably flawed practices of guidance. I want to refresh some of our thinking about how we decide who will be our guides and what sort of guides we will be to others. I stress the involvement of the guided party in appointing their guide and see this as a second key feature. So, first key feature, guidance is necessarily imperfect. Second key feature, the follower's implication in choosing their guide. My title quotation, Je vous tiens pour ma guide, s'il vous plaît, is taken from Burgundian court writer Jean Molyneux's Oraison de Saint-Hippolyte, a 15th century poetic prayer for guidance. The quote shows how guide is not an objectively acquired title, but the result of an investment by the person who ascribes the term and thereby chooses to follow. Molyneux's persona pleads, Soyez mon vrai docteur en votre histoire. He seems to evoke a reciprocally exclusive relationship, but neither je nor vous is singular in whom it designates. On one level, Molyneux's personae within the text implores the purported addressee Saint Hippolytus for intercessory guidance towards spiritual salvation. On another level, the authorial without the text is seeking to secure the favour of sponsorship from the poem's dedicatee, the financier Hippolyte de Berthaud. Such plurality is characteristic of medieval dits. There is narrative multi-layering involved. It is the dits of the prolific 14th century poet and composer Guillaume de Machaut that will be my focus today. I am speaking about him as a direct result of myself having invested in certain guides. Professor Jane Taylor, as Catherine mentioned, who introduced me to late medieval literature as an undergraduate 25 years ago. My own students over the past 18 years in Oxford, and the interdisciplinary international Machaldian community of scholars who welcomed me, a 15iste, so generously at a conference 15 years ago. Most recently and specifically, je tiens pour ma guide, musicologist Professor Larry Arp. For a volume of essays in his honour last year, I took as cue the title of his seminal handbook for Machaut studies that you have on the right on the slide, A Guide to Research, and thought about the role and significance of guides past and present. The whole enterprise of academic guidance merits considerable interrogation. Whom we take to be our guides plays a determining role in defining not only the field of our research, but also the whole imaginary of what roles of guidance are, how they are performed, and who any given we or our is. The identity and status of guides has been interrogated deeply in efforts to decolonize Western institutions of knowledge, including the academy. And I'd here like to gesture gratefully to panel 1.4 on decolonizing and decentering academic knowledge and practice. Its speakers articulated in a much better digested and more sophisticated way some of what I'm saying here. As Vandana Shiva affirms, colonialism has from the very beginning been a contest over the mind and the intellect, what will count as knowledge, and who will count as expert or as innovator. Boundaries and hierarchies of knowledge have typically been presented as self-evident by scholars of the global north. To quote Achille Mbembe, Western epistemic traditions are traditions that claim detachment of the known from the knower. He counterpoints this with relationality, and in place of the university, he and others have argued for a pluriversity, and I'm here using the same quotation as Brigitte Stepanov from panel 1.4, a pluriversity being a process of knowledge production working through a horizontal strategy of openness to dialogue among different epistemic traditions. Institutions need not only to challenge, but also to reimagine the structures through which different voices are granted space and authority. In the words of George Sefardé and Stanley Doyle Wood, referencing Gayatri Spivak, what are the spaces, political positions, textual locations, discourses and moments from which particular voices speak? When and how do they speak? Whose voice is assigned legitimacy or illegitimacy? I began this talk by asking how you got where you're now sitting. I want to start looking at guides in Machaut's dits by asking how the narrator-protagonist of his most popular narrative work, Le Jugement du Roi de Bohême, got where he's shown crouching in the mid-right-hand column of the first folio of the poem in BNF Français 1584. How did he end up there? He starts off, as the image at the top of the left-hand column shows, in a courtly locus amoenus, standing by a stream in a walled garden, looking at a bird in a tree. This renders quite precisely the situation evoked in the text, where la douceur du joli temps nouvelle disposes him to hearken and follow birds. Si liémon est de si grand revel chantois-tu que je allais à l'appel de leur doux chant. Si on choisit en l'air un voletant, et je le suivis tant qu'en un détour, sur un ruissel près d'une belle tour, s'alla soir. L'or me laissait tout bellement chouer et me cotit si bien à m'empouer sous les arbres qu'il ne me peut voir pour écouter. Assertive first-person verbs and particularizing prepositional phrases highlight the narrator-protagonist's active role in guiding himself to this spot in the bushes. They also highlight his active retrospective role in shaping description of the scene. Listening and seeing are key in the text. What he can hear, and installing himself in relation to what he sees so he cannot be seen. This anticipates what immediately follows when he, a clerk, sees approaching two aristocrats, a lady and a knight, whom he initially mistakes for lovers. Si ma pensée qu'amir et ami, L'orme bouté par-dedans la feuille, si embûchier qu'il ne me vire mis. Obvious thing to do, you see two people having a tryst, you dive in a bush. Note his vocabulary choice in embûchier, literally placed in a bush, but not crouching in fear or subordination, because reserving the possibility of surprise emergence, ambush, a position of power. The lady and the knight talk. If you know the poem, they talk quite a lot. They discuss their respective circumstances of amorous grief. The lady's beloved has died, the knight's lady has jilted him. They conclude by discussing how to procure themselves a judge to determine whose grief is the greater. They each look to the other's guidance, but reach an impasse. Dame, je veuille que le juge soit fait tout à vos veuilles, mais au vôtre beau sire, et si conseil qu'il ne soit fait que par votre conseil. To break the deadlock, third-party guidance appears in the form of our protagonist emerging from his bush at an opportune moment. That opportunity is provided by the lady's little dog. It has intruded into his hiding place, such that returning her canine companion gives the clerk his entrée pour avoir voué et achouézant d'aller où je voulais. He introduces himself to the pair as self-appointed guide, strategically recasting his happenstance ambush as judiciously intentioned self-guidance. Pour ceux venus suis aviser aimant, pour vous nommer un chevalier qui moult fait à aimer. The protagonist's nominee as judge is the eponymous King of Bohemia, John of Luxembourg, who employed extra-textual macho as secretary. He conducts the pair to the king's castle for judgment. J'irai devant et vous viendrez après. Tactfully and tactically omitting his initial mistake in taking them for lovers. On folio 9 verso, therefore, the visual transition between the two images does not signal diminishing status for the persona. On the contrary, barely visible, crouched low to the ground, blended in maximally with the surrounding foliage through dexterous use of grisaille, he is in the second image in powerful embûche. Seeing and hearing are key in the miniatures as they were in the text. Whilst the persona is hidden from the knight and the lady, as well as her maiden dog, we as viewers see him and thereby appreciate collusively the significance of his concealed presence. Additionally, parallelism between the two miniatures in character placement and head tilt foregrounds the act of listening. The protagonist guides our perspective through the manuscript's images as well as through its text, wherein his role as guide in offering solution to the debating pair's impasse enables narrative and discursive progression. His stature in the tale is evoked in the second miniature by having all four other figures pictured facing towards him, as if addressing him for his conseil, but at a point in time before they have been made aware of his presence by his emergence from the bush. An important point about guiding emerges from this example, namely the shifting relationship between guiding and guided parties. A given figure is rarely uniquely one or the other, whence the cooperation of wills entailed by the act of guidance. It is an offer assented to, not an imposition. The protagonist offers the pair verbal counsel and physical direction through a collective first-person imperative, allons-nous-en. They consent to follow. Guiding and guided parties are each contingent upon the other's will to achieve progress. As when the knight relates to the King of Bohemia how the protagonist si nous lois que les droits et les torts fussent mis sur vous, et ce fut nos accords. The protagonist does not provide the judgment on their debate, the what, but furnishes a way to acquire it, a how. And that is necessarily imperfect, incomplete, because his contribution as guide can take them only so far. This limit is represented physically in the text as the threshold of the king's chamber in his castle. Our persona doesn't enter it himself to accompany the knight and lady, but is caught on its threshold. And from its threshold, his gaze lights on another clerkly figure already inside the chamber. Et autant clair que nommé ne saroué qui lilisoué la bataille de Troie. What's happening here is something quite common in medieval dits, wherein literary subjectivity operates as a non-unitary entity. Continually in formation, it can be shared between figures in a narrative. There's a kind of relay between our narrator-protagonist and the tale-telling status of this second figure in terms of the text's shifting point of view. It's implied that we hear the account of the knight and lady at court from the second Claire, since the first didn't have access there. This is a further de-specific way in which we shouldn't be construing guiding and guided selves as discrete identities. The role of guide is shared between characters. Such sharing is evident in an illustration for the jugement in a later manuscript, which hyperbolizes the ironic disjuncture between the protagonist's minimal visual presence and his narrative stature as guide. He appears as a face only, set in a profusely leaved, exaggeratedly large bush. Reminiscent of the popular Homer Simpson in the hedge meme, and I do not mean this flippantly, as I will explain in a moment, but I'll just take Homer off for a sec. When I say he appears in the bush, I'm in fact activating several different identity possibilities in characteristic D manner. First, the visual conjunction of narrator, protagonist, and king could gesture extra-textually to historical Machaut's service of John of Luxembourg. Second, in relation to the text's narrative, we can infer pictorial conflation of two differently located moments. The bush-concealed protagonist overhearing the pair's debate, and the pair presenting their debate to the king in his castle, where the protagonist is not present, but the second clerkly figure is, and so the figure in the bush designates him too. The roles of the two Claire, guiding the pair to their judge and recounting the judgment, are evoked through the one face. Why I say my pop culture reference to Homer in the hedge isn't flippant is because of an interestingly parallel disjuncture between how the cartoon visual gets used in an embarrassed exit strategy meme and its original context in episode 16 of season 5, Homer Loves Flanders. I here invite my able technical assistant. So what the GIF doesn't show is how Homer not only exits but also enters Ned Flanders' driveway through the hedge. This intrusive moment, a kind of ambush, conveys Homer's overbearing pursuit of his neighbor's company.
Oh, almost. Boy, that was close.
Hey, what's up for today, Nettie?
Homer, we're gonna visit the boy's grandmother. Family only, you know?
Right, no reporters.
No, I mean just the Flanders family.
Oh, okay.
And I particularly wanted the sound to accompany that, thank you, able assistant, because it matches with what former showrunner David Merkin has commented about it. Homer backing into the bushes is thus not, quote, a retreat or an embarrassment as it's used. It was really just an ominous, threatening look and a very weird backing up while never breaking eye contact with Flanders. It's thus about shifting boundaries and authority, the ethics of access, following a gaze, and seeing a scene through different perspectives. Could my able assistant possibly ably assist? Just to transition to the next slide, I think it's just got a bit stuck. Perfect, thank you. Such shifting brings me to the second text by Machaut in which I want to consider specificities of guidance. I take the D commonly hailed as Machaut's most deeply didactic, the Remède de Fortune. The Remède charts the journey of an inexperienced poet-lover protagonist as he learns through the guidance of personified Espérance to live, love, and compose better in order to eschew the throes of fortune. The poem immediately presents itself as a manual for educating vrai humain entendement, opening, S'il qui vouait au canard apprendre, à 12 choses doit entendre. This initial sententia gets didactically ballasted in the following lines by an array of imperatives, exhortations, proclamations, etc. However, beneath the declamatory clarity of this surface rhetoric bubble uncertainties. What are the proclaimed 12 matters? Their enumeration stops in the text somewhat pathetically after the first. And whose is the unidentified guiding voice here? expression remains impersonal until line 44, when voice is claimed by the retrospective narrator protagonist, referring to ce que j'ai dit ci-dessus. What agenda is informing his presentation of this didactic template? Is it to legitimize the personal amorous experience that he will proceed to recount, or to critique it? Line 95 tilts towards the latter. Si avouez bien métier d'apprendre, quand elle fait vouloir entreprendre, que dis-je? Ainsi l'avoué entrepris, qu'un congé n'est conseil non pris. He recognizes the heedlessness of his youth, admitting that instead of first having dutifully followed a course of instruction in the art of love, matters 1 through 12, we infer, he dived straight in. Guidance was offered, but not accepted. The poem's pedagogy has not only a rather unstable beginning, but also a rather bumpy didactic texture as a whole regarding the fruits of the lover's education and the extent to which his humain entendement develops much at all. After following the guidance of Espérance to persevere in desire for his lady, he remains in epistemological uncertainty, unsure in the end what his lady's affections are. Que je ne puis en le voir de la mensonge concevoir. This doesn't sound like progress in understanding. Does that mean that Espérance was a bad guide? She promised him étudier en la droite sainte. Was she leading him down the wrong path? Or did she lead him down the right path, but not do so effectively? I'd argue for neither, and propose instead that what is at issue is the protagonist's implementation of guidance, which is in itself neither sound nor unsound. It helps him only temporarily as a lover, granted, but enduringly as a poet of love who continues hopefully to sing the vagaries of fortune in the lyrics he composes. We as audience, thus guided, can thereby reframe our reading of the opening passage's programme of education. The protagonist's underlying devotion is to the aucun art of composition. Guidance involves shifting position and framing, and I want to sit for a while with the opening illustration of the Remède in BNF Français 1586, known as Manuscript C, the earliest of Machaut's author manuscripts, possibly destined for Bonne, John of Luxembourg's wife. It's an unidentifiable figure at extreme left, on whom I ultimately want to focus, but it's worth noting that the identity of most any of these figures is ambiguous, given that the image exists independently of any scene in the narrative. Interpretation 1. The miniature depicts the protagonist gazing at the noble lady he desires as she pauses on the steps of her magnificent residence, accompanied by an entourage of 3 ladies in waiting. It thereby sets a scene for the love story that is to follow, which duly features a 200-and-something line description of the lady's beauty, dress, and virtues from the adoring protagonist's point of view. He details the inception of his devotion to her. Ses yeux, en riant, m'ont en maint lieu prié que par amour l'amasse. Interpretation 2 maintains this cast of characters, but raises a question of the protagonist's age. In his retrospective narration in the text, he states that this loving is how he spent his youth, s'user en semant ma jouvence. So what is shown in the image? Him as experiencing I, as the young man who lived through it, or him as he is now looking back as narrating I, commanding an older but no less devoted point of view, still as invested now as then, no less subjective. Interpretation 3 considers an alternative candidate for the lady here, namely Espérance. She is the one character in the text who is accorded a castle, sort of. She speaks metaphorically of being the chastiau et forteresse of troubled lovers, and the persona then addresses her as their mur, chastiau, and confort. So the image embodies Espérance in anthropomorphic form, something quite usual for medieval illustration of personifications, and it literalizes her role as a physical castle that she inhabits. Interpretation 4, which is the last one, if we're thinking of feminine-gendered authorities, we don't need to limit ourselves to Espérance. Extra-textually, there's Bonne of Luxembourg as the likely destinataire. Within the text, we have feminine-gendered amour, and the persona casts all 3 of amour, Espérance and his lady in a guiding capacity. Amour me prit-elle en sa gouvernance, Espérance m'a séduit, and as for his lady, ainsi la très noble doctrine qui tant est précieuse et fine, de la belle me doctrina, qui toute bonne doctrine a. The accumulation of polyptote on an epiphora and a touch of rime équivoque cannot but invite scrutiny of how valid such ascription of didactic authority proves to be. This brings us finally to our figure at extreme left, a companion to the protagonist, whose identity is unaccounted for by correspondence with any personage in the text. He seems both superfluous and strikingly prominent. I think he is inserted as a kind of guide. Well, I would. I think he is inserted as a kind of guide by the guiding hand of the illustrator or compiler, remembering that Machaut himself supervised manuscript C. This guide acts as a cue for reflection on guidance and point of view. This figure hasn't been viewed in this light by previous commentators on this otherwise much discussed, because rather marvelous manuscript image. They have been referred to instead as, quote, a young manservant to the protagonist, which is perfectly plausible if we want to ascribe to this companion a particular identity. The lady is, after all, for her part, accompanied by ladies-in-waiting in a parallel position. And it's true that some other manuscripts opening miniatures for the Remède show both an older and a younger male in conversation. For instance, manuscript A here has an elderly bearded man sitting addressing a youth. What we see in manuscript C, though, is rather different. The figure at left operates as a kind of pivot who invites us to focus on the activity of seeing. Positioned within the image, physically aligned with the protagonist, but with the feather of his cap protruding without the frame of the miniature, and his back turned somewhat towards the viewer of the page, aligning him with our vantage point. As I noted above, in one interpretation, the image shows the lady exactly as described by the retrospective narrator protagonist in the text. Ses yeux, en riant, m'ont en main lieu prier que par amour l'amasse. Her willed intention is underscored by the pointed finger that she gestures in his direction. This is a scene, therefore, of the protagonist consenting to being seduced by the lady's gaze. Et mes cœurs voulaient que je fusse tout ce sien, et je aussi le voulais. Et pour ce aïeux m'ont conseillé, si qu'ainsi fuit, si Dieu me gare, pris par doux rire et doux regard. But is the doux regard in question definitely proceeding from her gaze, not his? Might we in fact construe it as a wish-fulfillment projection from his eyes through force of his desiring will, the repeated vouloir in that quotation? He is seeing, in other words, what he wants to see, the lady desiring him. What he sees is consonant with what he recounts in the text, but can anyone vouch for the reliability of that account when, as we noted above, he ultimately finds that he cannot interpret his lady's gaze, or perhaps chooses not to, lest it be detrimental to his desires? Que je ne pus oncle le voir de la mensonge concevoir. I contend that the presence and positioning of this additional viewer figure encourages such scrutiny and prompts a second look at how the content of this scene may be framed, opening it up as a question and intersecting thereby with the questionable didacticism of the poem's opening passage. Unlike the later manuscript's illustrations, manuscript C does not portray the relationship between the two men as one of hierarchy. The additional figure looks at the persona looking and sees what he observes, though not quite how he sees it, from a different angle, at one remove, set back at a slight distance. He offers, through my interpretation, an implied commentary on the persona's activity of seeing, guiding our view as audience of both text and image. Epistemological intersubjectivity in D is primarily anthropocentric. But this does not mean that guiding human gazers are not at least in part constituted by non-human surroundings, that there are not reciprocal entanglements between human, animal and vegetal, organic and inorganic elements as part of the routes to knowledge that they explore. We've already seen a quasi, I'd emphasize the quasi-eco-materialist interaction of human and non-human through the role of shrubbery in miniatures for the jugement. Such interaction comes most forcibly to the fore when encountering the opening image of the final dit in manuscript C, le dit du lion, in which no human figure is depicted. This absence is all the more striking as absence when it is viewed intervisually alongside the parallel half-page miniatures opening each of the preceding dits, in which at least one human figure evokes the first-person protagonist of the ensuing tale. In brief, what I think is happening through this sequence of miniatures is a kind of sensitization of the reader-viewer to an interaction of human and non-human elements that orientates their epistemological eye view. So, the first in the series is the jugement. Looking from left to right, moving in the same direction as the text, we as viewers are ushered into the scene by the protagonist. The disposition of the figures in the foreground, and I include the central shrubbery, guide us into two different moments in the plot. The persona concealed in embûche, eavesdropping on conversation, and the persona emerged, his equal physical stature here with knight and lady betokening his narrative authority, with the hand gestures of the pair seeming to identify him as their recruited guide. They are according him that authority to conduct them hence. On folio 23 recto's Remède miniature, the compositional template of having a left-hand point of view cue reoccurs in the companion figure whom I've just been discussing. The protagonist sets his sights on the inorganic figure of the castle, whose architectural design gives us a threshold, and thus a question mark over right to access and to grant access, an analogous ethical question raised by the bush in the jugement in respect of the noble's conversation. An ethical question is also raised by the opening image of Le Dit des Quatre Oiseaux. The poem's persona recounts his life experiences with 4 hunting birds, in a tale that entwines accounts of falconry with a story of education in amorous courtship. The miniature points to such entwinement through its imagery of trapping butterflies, plucking flowers, and catching birds. These literalize conventional courtly metaphors of amorous pursuit. 4 human figures are shown, suggesting the 4 hunting bird experiences in the text. An ethical question mark is raised visually regarding the age of the humans illustrated, boys at play. In the text, the persona describes how a young man's character is formed from his childhood and how boyhood games may lead to either courtesy or villainy. Which are we seeing here? It depends in part on the guides one chooses, and the text's protagonist, he tells us, follows falconers. From an ornithological focus, we move to the botanical in the Dit du Vergier, in which the persona receives guidance in courtship from the god of love. He begins sans conduit, but then love me moustroie l'avoué, albeit of way that doesn't progress narratively, given this persona's status as an unrequited lover. The opening miniature captures this limitation. In position and posture, the protagonist echoes that of the jugement, but here without an invitation to action, apart from his ongoing commitment of will to follow love. Quand vers amour suis-ci tourné que nul rien ne me détourne. There's no bower depicted in the text. It is a pictorial innovation which combines the organic and the human-made. It should be the site of an amorous rendezvous, and it is such a scenario of intimate conversation with his lady that the Vergier persona desires, and in which he sees other couples engaging in the general bucolic scene of the narrative, but he has not been granted access to it. Whereas the jugement persona can appropriate a propitiously positioned shrubbery for his purposes, the Vergier persona cannot populate the bower. He can, in effect, fashion the framework through his courtly dedication, but cannot occupy it with his story. We look at him looking at what he cannot have. This brings us finally to the opening miniature of the Dit du Lion. Whom and how do we see here, and what do we mean by seeing? The landscape is multiply populated by organic, inorganic, and animal elements. wood, shrubs and flowers, earth and stream, birds perched in trees and river birds, and at back left, a partially concealed castle. No human is visible, but the scene nonetheless carries an implication of human occupation: hunting birds, game animals, and a human-built construction. There is an echo of masculine human presence in how our regular point of view Q at left is now a stag. The poem scenario has the protagonist viewing an enchanted island of permanent springtime surrounded by a river. He stands on the opposite bank trying to find a way to cross. He initially has no guide, sans compagnie, except for us as reader viewers. In the image, therefore, we're not here looking at a persona looking, but are looking with him, alongside him. In the text, after being transported across the water by a magical boat, he depicts himself guided by love, amour qui me duit, which makes him think of his lady whilst listening to birdsong. Analogously, we as viewers of the image think of the persona whilst looking at birds. In the poem, he then encounters its principal guide figure, the eponymous lion. Et en mi avouait un buisson moult épais, from which the lion leaps out and takes him to his, the lion's lady, the queen of the garden. Salle au devant et je après. It seems to the persona that the lion says to him, vous êtes en mon conduit. Seeing how devoted the lion is to his lady, the persona intercedes with her on his non-speaking companion's behalf to voice his dedicated service to her and advocate for his, the lion's, protection. The time eventually comes for the persona to leave. Le lion me convoya, back to the river, and once he's crossed back to the other side, en l'air perdit l'avait eu. There's a lot going on here and very limited time to unpack it, but I want to conclude by drawing out a few aspects of multidirectional correspondence between human and non-human in the poem's capacious epistemology. First, the shifts between guiding and guided. The persona, the lion, and the lady in the garden each both act as guide and receive guidance in the course of the tale. Second, shifting animal identity of the lion. He's described within the tale as a little dog, notably when he first appears to the protagonist from the bush, comme si fût un petit chiennet. This brings us to my third point regarding the, to me, frankly, irresistible intertextuality and intervisuality between this last D in the sequence in manuscript C and the first, the jugement baigne. Analogy with a little dog recalls how the jugement lady's canine companion prompted its protagonist's emergence from the bush. The jugement protagonist acted as guide to return the dog to her, whilst the lion's as-if little dog returns itself to its lady, guiding the protagonist thither. The shrubbery is again key as a locus of reorientation or epistemological mutation. Is it one of those shrubberies we see in the lion's miniature? Should we be on the alert for the animal's embûche in the bushes? Or have we, like the protagonist at the end of his island journey, lost the lion from view? We find the protagonist and the lion illustrated together on folio 105 verso. The protagonist and animal carry echoes of their counterparts in the jugement in ways that bend and shape around the relationship of guidance and companionship. The identity of each protagonist is partly constituted by their connection to another character, not only within their text, but also intertextually and intervisually. The lion's protagonist echoes in posture that of the jugement image, but also stands for the knight and lady, in the sense that within the lion, the protagonist is the one guided by the bush-emerging lion, and the lion is therefore, in turn, as guide, an echo of the jugement protagonist. Such circulation and interrelation are not simply a matter of aesthetic engagement or material design, though they undoubtedly lend striking coherence to a manuscript devised to gather together a single author's works under the supervision of that author. In the case of manuscript C's D, there is also an ethical implication about guidance as an exercise of power, will, and responsibility on behalf of both guiding and guided parties, given the ambiguities of any given situation into which one chooses to intervene, risks of misunderstanding, the thresholds that may be crossed thereby, and the later stage ramifications of a given moment of physical or verbal orientation. If there is ethical implication, to what extent does that invite evaluation by the reader-viewer? Should we be classifying guides as good or bad, like Boethius's philosophy condemning the poetic muses? I think not in the D, and this is where my insistence on the inherent imperfection of guidance comes to the fore. And I mean imperfection without value judgment attached. Guidance is of its nature incomplete and partial because it is intersubjective and the fruit of distributed responsibility between guiding and guided parties, who are themselves not necessarily clearly separate or distinct, as we've seen. Guides are also more often plural than singular. Boethius's philosophy is a bit of an outlier rather than a model in that regard. Full knowledge, or total self-knowledge, will never be the fruits of late medieval D protagonists, who will never surrender the partiality of their vouloir, compositionally revisiting their lovesick amorous experience, guiding themselves and their readers towards the present through a mapping of the past, like the Remède persona never knowing for sure what his lady meant. A scenario of guidance is an exhortation to think, learn, unlearn, relearn, critically and together in companionship with openness to the future. How does this all relate to the overall framework of didacticism then? Is guidance a particularly didactic orientation, or are the two synonymous? Thinking about didacticism from the point of view of guidance helpfully loosens any rigid sense of a master-pupil instruction dynamic, arrests hasty value judgment, valorizes the role of an organizing gaze, and foregrounds the importance of collaboration, contingency, and process. Je vous tiens pour ma guide. As scholars of Guillaume de Machaut, we often want to take him as our guide. Many have identified as evidence of his guiding hand the supervisory authority relayed by the rubric opening manuscript A's index. Voici l'ordonnance que Guillaume de Machaut veut qu'il ait en son livre. But this too is only an expression of wish, scribally reported from or attributed to Machaut as editor. Interpretation of editorial organization lies with the reader in response, and the onus is indeed placed on the reader in the far less frequently cited rubric closing that index in manuscript A, which refers to a following list of lyrics. Ces choses qui s'en suivent trouveraient un remède de fortune. We may be organized, accompanied, and facilitated in our search and research processes, but it is up to us what we find and to watch out for shrubberies. Thank you very much.
Helen, thank you so much for guiding us so expertly through some complex imagery, manuscripts, text, and ultimately bringing us back to Homer Simpson and Bush, which is always a good way to end. I want to abuse my position as chair just very briefly to talk about the position of the viewer of the images as distinct or possibly not distinct from the reader. You conflated the two as the reader-viewer. And I think, but I might be wrong, and I'd like to sort of, your take on this, that's signaled more with these images by the fact they all appear to be read left to right, which is a textual reading practice, and actually not as common in 15th century illustration as you might think. How do you think these illustrations in this manuscript are being used? Are they a surrogate for reading? That is it a picture book where you're showing people as you tell the story? Or is it a purely personal, individual experience of reading and viewing?
Terrific question.
Yeah.
How long have you got? No. So firstly, to pick up on what wasn't your question, but what was underpinning your question, I admit, fairly expedient conflation of reader and viewer, and obviously one would want to parse that and think about, well, who has access to, who's doing the reading process, what's going on. So yes, we'll just park that. In terms of, I suppose, the status of the visual, well, of the images, let's say, the miniatures. I was going to say the visual, but of course that comprises a lot more than the miniatures in relation to reading experience. I mean, one could say, well, let's take the sheer size of these miniatures on the page, the opening miniatures, rather than the ones that are just in the inserted in individual columns, and they do have quite a commanding presence. They're quite dominant on the page. You can't miss them. It's tricky because I don't want to fall into what I'd normally say, which is to argue for the kind of richly sophisticated reading expertise and competence that one theorizes about late medieval audiences who are all, you only have to just show them any sort of, just a hint of a flower and it's immediately, Roman de la Rose is right there. So that kind of deftness and intertextual competence and dexterity that's supposed, and therefore that would argue for the sense that these images are already being read in rich ways before they're even thought about in the context of these particular texts. So in other words, there's in a way, there's no viewing of the images that's not already a reading process. But then that does bring us back to the question of, well, what am I meaning by reading there in terms of how anyone viewing the images themselves encountered the texts that they're thereby recalling intertextually. So that's a nice little circle.
Yeah. And then just sort of, is this the only manuscript that has that sort of iconographical program associated with it?
So across the several collected works manuscripts or author manuscripts of Machaut, this is the only one that has the images in this order. Oh, sorry, the only one that has the texts in this order and therefore the images in this order. And does so pretty strikingly in that the kind of rules, conventions, whatever you want to call them, of other manuscripts in terms of which texts come before other texts seem very much to be the contrary of what we've got in manuscript C, which somewhat enables me, I would argue, that there is a specific design going on here. Obviously, this is the earliest, so then you could say, well, does that mean that subsequent compilers may or may not have had any access to this manuscript, didn't get the possibilities. They didn't read the Jugement d'Aigne and the Dits du Lion and think, little dog and bush, and then just decide that's the way to frame everything. Yeah.
Are there questions from the audience? I think we have a microphone that you have to speak into. There's one there. And as always, if you could say your name when you ask your question.
Thank you, Rebecca Vince. This is not at all my area, but I found it passionnant. I was wondering about this quote about doctrine, which translates very noble teaching. And I was really intrigued by the figures of espérance and amour in the plural. And it just struck me that maybe there was some biblical intertextuality there about faith, hope, and charity, and that, but also the woman of noble character and wisdom personified, and because, yeah, it's this beautiful woman in whom all virtuous doctrine is to be found, instructing. I wondered if that was going on.
Yes, I mean, I think there's a sort of neither ghosting nor shadowing seems the right metaphor to be using, but the kind of interaction implied by, well, as soon as you're getting one of these didactic figures in the case of, okay, what's the range of possibilities that are informing this in terms of mythological tradition, in terms of biblical tradition, and how those, so there's a sense, there's always a hinterland there in terms of, so what's this one doing? Espérance is everywhere as a personification, and I think for me, that makes it all the more kind of roll sleeves up as to what's this, where's this espérance being positioned in relation to questions of the extent to which there's any matter of faith going on here, the extent to which there's wisdom and wisdom of what kinds, and how is wisdom relating to questions of knowledge, and where's that going, and who's learning, and how are they, all of those. So I think it's a kind of activation point of exactly what you're identifying is always simmering there to feed into or kind of collide in any given instantiation of these figures.
I feel like I should give the biggest workout to the microphone. So question there, and then one there. Distributing the microphone around the room.
Cheers. Thanks, Richard. So I'm Maddie Chalmers, and I have a question about little dogs and big dogs as well. So obviously we have the bush as this kind of recurring theme, but we've also got the chianet who crops up in La Châtelaine de Vergy. And then you have big dogs, Justin in Biron's Tristan. And I was wondering, on your kind of non-human theme, to what extent dogs, large and small, might also act as guides or kind of agent provocateur in some situations. That's not too stupid a question from a non-medievalist.
Not remotely, no. I mean, there is there's at least one book dedicated to the subject of dogs in medieval, is it medieval illustration? I'm not looking at Sophie because she wrote it, but because I know we referred to it recently. So I have two thoughts. One of them is, I've always thought of little dogs or dogs in general in these contexts. You just think, okay, narrative device. You know, and so one's thinking about them in terms of their functional role and not really paying attention, therefore, to what animal are you exactly and what kind of dog are you? So that's my second thought. So my first thought is narrative device defined through function, but then having more of a, okay, but let's just think about what is any specificity here, and that being, because I suppose one could say hello bestiaries, and thinking about animal symbolism, of which there's a rich tradition, of course, in medieval literature and medieval didacticism, but then what may not be that kind of animal allegorical significance mapping going on, but whether there's something more about dogs as dogs, I suppose. Don't have an answer.
A question here, and then one there. I'm doing it.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, I'm Tom Hinton. I really like what you were saying about the agency of the guided and the need to agree to be guided for that to kind of, there's a two-way relationship. And there's an obvious kind of congruence with what you were saying about the interpretive agency and responsibility of the reader as well, and sort of agreeing to be guided by the text. But at the same time, when you were talking about the Dits du Lion, I was struck by the kind of, the fact that he doesn't know where the line's going or why he's following him really. And and I was thinking about it's kind of similar in the guy jumping out of the bush, that I think, if I was one of the two people debating, I'm not sure I'd follow. I'd be like, yeah, great, I'll follow you. Lead me wherever you want. You were in a bush. So I wonder, is there, there's a kind of, that's quite a medieval trope, right? The kind of the boat that arrives and you don't know why it's, where it's going to take you, and the need to show faith, right? Is there a tension there between that, the need to show faith and the need to kind of think carefully and advisedly? And if so, is it one that the Dits address, and what do they have to say about it?
Really good question. I think your question is one reason why somewhere towards the end of what I was saying, I referred to an openness to the future, which was a phrase I couldn't pinpoint any more precisely because I was feeling in tension between a sense of you don't know where this is going to go, but you've committed to going, well, you're not sure where. So that sense of there's been an investment, and that investment has somewhat a measure of deliberateness, somewhat a measure of happenstance, and so one could say that one thought that's in my mind at the moment is, so is this an argument for the virtue of serendipity? And I think there's a measure of that. But I think there's also a question, as it's animated, as those questions are animated in these texts, and what's going on with temporality is also occurring to me in terms of, because so many of these narratives are, here's me now talking about what happened to me then, and I'm going to get you to where I am now. So there's a kind of circular movement. So what's in the future is actually in the past in relation to the present, when you're going through the past in order to get to the present, if you're kind of still. And therefore, I don't know, some sense of, I suppose this is all about, the paragraph I cut out was about prudence, which was perhaps pertinent. But in terms of that sense of the extent to which you know where you're going and what that knowing means. So knowing where you're going doesn't mean I know I'm going to get to this point, but I know what I am entailing by following this path. And I think that's the sort of knowledge that's most getting animated, or at least you know, you acquire that knowledge somewhere along taking the path, whether metaphorical or, as so often in these texts, a literal path. So yeah, I think it requires, and I'm thinking about this in my own formulation of it now, it requires quite a lot of precision as to how one's using the question of knowledge and epistemology and how that falls. Thank you for that.
There was a question at the back. I wonder if there's any questions also on the Zoom, because I think, no. Okay, so we've time for this question at the back, and then I think further questions over lunch.
Thank you, Helen, for your wonderful presentation. I very much enjoy all these illustrations you put there. I have no experience in medieval studies, but coming from film studies, I'm very much into image analysis, and especially the idea of gestural connection across the frames as well. But from a recent discussion with an art historian, I realized in their iconographical studies, texts always occupy a very central position, and they would not consider a good material to study if there's no text to finally validate their interpretation. So I guess my question might be a bit open and broad, but I would like to know how much you see the autonomy can an image preserve in terms of interpretation, or how do you see the relation between text and images, and how much we also rely on text to interpret an image?
That's a really good question. And I think there's a significant, obviously a significant methodological dimension to that, because I'm always acutely aware of my own predispositions in terms of encountering the illustrations of these texts, nearly always after having read the text concerned, and therefore that presupposing my response to them and my thinking about that kind of relationship. One of the things that is particularly, I'll say interesting, because I haven't committed to a more precise word, about that the Remède de Fortune opening illustration that I spent quite a lot of time on in my talk, is that it doesn't match with any scene in the narrative, whereas nearly all of the others did or could be mapped onto it in a more straightforward way. And so that sense of some independence of the image, and therefore the status of the image. I'm also thinking about, so slipping back into the 15th century or slipping forward into the 15th century, the shifting relationship. So I thought I was going to get through a talk without mentioning Martin Lefranc, but I haven't. Martin Lefranc's Le Champion des Dames, which is what I talk about a lot, massively long work, rivals in length the Romance of the Rose, great tradition of illustrated manuscripts of it. And across that, you see a great variation between manuscripts that are really, here's the images, and we've just like not scribbled the text beneath it, but the text is in a very tasty secretary hand rather than a presentation script. So in terms of indications of the privileging of the value of the images, and then also the question of the images in relation to other visual components of the page, which can also themselves include text in terms of what happens in the margins. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in response to that question. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you, Helen, and thank you for giving us so much to unpack, both visually and verbally, and just giving us a beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, visually. I mean, I appreciate saying all this with a picture of a butter icing Homer Simpson above my head, but a really visually rich ending to the conference and a beautiful plenary. Thank you so much.